Okay, welcome everybody on behalf of Holocaust Museum LA. My name is Michael Morgenstern, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our discussion with Lillian Trilling, a Holocaust survivor from Poland. Before we begin, I would like to share a few words about the museum. Holocaust Museum LA is the first Holocaust survivor founded Holocaust museum in the United States. In the 1960s, a group of survivors worked together to create a memorial for their loved ones who perished in the Holocaust, and this memorial eventually became Holocaust Museum LA. These survivors who established our museum did so with a mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. Furthermore, they mandated that our museum should always be free to the public, making Holocaust education accessible to everyone. Even though we are not able to be in our museum's physical space for the time being, we are still able to carry forward their mission. This morning, you have the honor and privilege of listening to Lillian Trilling, who will share her story with you. After Lillian shares her story, you will have the opportunity to ask questions. To those watching on Zoom, you can type your questions in the Q&A box, and those watching on Facebook can type it in the comments. She will answer as many questions as possible for our time frame. Lillian has been speaking at our museum for just about a year or two, and she's spoken to several school groups, and this is her first time doing a talk for our museum on Zoom. And so, Lillian, I am so honored to welcome you today. Thank you so much for being with us and for sharing your story. And you may begin.
You want me to start now?
Yes, please.
Okay. I guess I can see myself. Okay. I'm Lillian Trilling. Um, I have, I was born in a town called Lodz, which is Lodz, which is the second largest town in Poland after Warsaw. And in 1940, we moved with my family. We had to Warsaw, and we moved into the Warsaw Ghetto, which had at one point 450,000 people living in a very, very small space. My father, my mother, my aunt, and my niece, my aunt's daughter, we all lived together in one large room. And my aunt had a nurse for her daughter, Elizabeth. And the nurse was willing to come and take Elizabeth out of the ghetto, which she did. She came, she got through. Usually by bribing somebody, you could get into the ghetto, even though it had 8-foot high walls with wire on top. But there were ways of getting in and out, and bribery was usual. And she came to get Elizabeth. And my father, the night before, unbeknownst to me, she came to us in the ghetto, and he talked to Janina and begged her to take me as well. Now you have to understand that Elizabeth was only 4 years old, my cousin, and I was 12. So there was a great degree of danger taking a much older child. But her nurse, Janina, was an extraordinary person. And after my father begged her to take me with her, she agreed to do that. She came the night before we left, and I don't remember exactly what month it was, but she came and she took me out and Elizabeth. And what we did, I think they paid the people at the wall to let us put a ladder to the wall. And then we jumped down from the ladder on the other side. And immediately, the three of us were accosted by people asking for money, which my parents gave to my nurse, Janina, and she gave them some money. And then we went off. And we went at the time to Lvov, which is another large city. Now it is no longer in Poland. I think it's in Lithuania. But in those days, it was in Poland. And we went to Lvov and we lived with Janina for about a year in Lvov. And she went to work and I was in charge. That's where I learned to cook at an early age and to make dinner and cook and do everything around the house because she worked all day. And we lived there for about a year. However, things in Lvov got bad, and Janina was afraid that our neighbors started suspecting that she was harboring Jewish children, and we had to leave. But she said when we had to leave Lvov that I couldn't come with her because she was going to take Elizabeth, who I said was much younger than I, who was only 4 or 5 at the time, to her family in Warsaw, and I would have to go on my own. Well, we got out, we came back from Lvov, and I got to Warsaw. And she went on to Lublin, where her family lived, and I was alone in Warsaw. And I have to tell you, to this day, I don't quite remember what my first few days alone were, except I remember that during the night, we had very large gates and apartment buildings, and I used to huddle in the gate for the night. And how many nights it was, I don't know. But and I don't know exactly, but eventually I got a job with a Polish family as a maid. And I slept in the kitchen. And unfortunately, the husband of the woman who hired me started getting some notions about wanting to visit me in the kitchen at night. And I didn't know what to do and decided right away I was going to run away. And I did. I ran away. And the next day, I went to a German work bureau called Arbeitsamt and gave them a cock and bull story about how my father was in Germany and I would like to go to Germany. And the reason I said that is this. Most of you probably at this point don't understand that in those days, Poles could identify Jews just by looking at us. I was dark-haired, and I would have immediately been spotted as Jewish, and that wasn't safe for me to do. So the idea of leaving Poland and going to Germany made sense because I realized on some level that Germans who didn't have as many Jewish people living in Germany were unable to recognize you by your looks. Now, remember, I was only a child, but still they could recognize me. So the next day, I went to something called Arbeitsamt, work bureau, and told them that I wanted to go to Germany because my father already went to Germany to work, and I wanted to go and work in Germany. And the next day, they said, come on in. And they said, you go to the train station. And I went to the train station and I got on the train, which they indicated to me. And much to my relief, the only people I shared the cabin with on the train were actually dark-haired, black-haired people, not the usual Poles who had blonde hair by and large and blue eyes. So I, with my dark hair, didn't stand out because their hair was darker. And it turned out that they were Armenian people, Armenians. So I felt fairly safe. And I got on the train, and about 2 hours after we crossed the border to Germany, somebody came in, I guess a conductor, and told me to get out of the train. I got out of the train and I saw a horse and a buggy and a guy who told me that I should go into the buggy with him. And it was winter, it was November, and it was full of snow. And we were now in Germany. I got to Germany and I didn't know where I was going. And I thought I might be going to a factory, weapons factory, because I heard that a lot of people worked in weapons factory where it would be really pretty awful assembling weapons and dangerous. But instead, we drove to a very beautiful place, which was snowing at that point, and it turned out to be a real castle, Eagan. And they told me to get off at the castle. We drove over a moat and they told me to get off. And when I went in, I was told that I was going to work in the yard. And I was shown a room actually in the castle, but I was going to work outdoors. Well, the next day I went outdoors, and much perhaps my luck was they sent me to milk a cow. And I had never milked a cow in my life. And the cow stepped on my foot. And I had a rather sore uh, foot. And they took me back into the house and decided I wasn't cut out for outdoors and I would become the housemaid and the cook's helper. And I became the cook's helper and lived in the castle in a very lovely room upstairs, which I shared with another Polish girl, except that it was hard because we shared the room. And as long as that girl, that Polish girl, was living there, I was afraid to sleep at night because I was afraid that I would speak in my sleep and betray myself and talk about my parents. Luckily, after about 4 weeks or so, the other girl left and I was alone, so I could go to sleep and get a good night's sleep. And I was assigned to work in the castle, helping the cook and clean the castle. And to be honest, I can say this was a 14th century castle with beautiful, beautiful paintings and with beautiful china and silver and ivories. And I got a real education in the arts, just dusting and cleaning the castle, the carpets and everything else. It was all really made of beautiful things, and I was pretty free to linger. Nobody really supervised me very much. So I got my education in the arts working in the German castle. It was called Eagan, which means Eagle House. And I worked there for about, uh, I worked in the castle for quite a long time. And I remember working in the house, unlike the rest of the Polish people who worked in the fields. And it is sad to say that the Polish people, even though I was only 11 or I was 12 years old, they recognized me and they started saying that I was Jewish. And the supervisor of the fields came to me one day and he said, uh, you have to run away because they are talking about your being Jewish. Now, I had already lived there for, I believe, 2 years at the castle, and it was 1945, and the British Army was very close to where I lived in Germany. So the supervisor said, well, you have to do something. And that night, I ran away from the castle and ran into the woods where the Third Army was coming in. And I was hiding in the woods. There were a couple of soldiers who were bleeding, wounded. And I was in between the two armies, the tanks of the Germans and the tanks of the advancing Americans who were coming in, and somehow managed to hug the trees and get out of harm's way when the Americans came in. The Americans came in. I think I spent 3 nights in the forest, and the Americans came in and jumped out of one of the big tanks, and basically they realized that I was Jewish because the guy who jumped out was Polish American, and he said, oh, she's just a Jew. But eventually I ended up working in the mess for officers, for officers um, in Germany. And while I was working in the mess for the officers in Germany, one day I overheard an officer who came in and he gave his name as Ossia Trilling, which is an unusual name. And I spoke to him since I was serving in the mess. I spoke to him and he said, yes, he was a Trilling, part of the Trilling family that lived in England. And we started talking and he said, I will tell your family that you are alive and we'll try to get you out of Germany. Well, it was quite a while before I could leave Germany. It took a long time for me to get the permit to come to England. But eventually I came to England and joined my English family of this cousin whom I met and lived with them for a while, probably about a year or so. And then later on, I felt and they felt that I was really, it was a burden for them to keep me. So I went out on my own. And by that time, I contacted my aunt, the only surviving living relative, my mother's sister, who lived in New York. And she started sending me some money so I could live until I got a visa to get into the US. It took a long time because I did not get to the US until January 1st, 1947. And I was in there since 1945, since the end of the war. So it was very hard to get into the US at the time. And I had a grand uncle who had to deposit an affidavit that he had $1 million for them to let me into the United States. But eventually I got out, and on January 1st, as I said, I made my way past the Statue of Liberty, landing in New York. And I remember looking at the Statue of Liberty and really crying. It made a really impression on me. Give me your poor, you're hungry. It give me your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest thoughts to me. I left my lamp beside the golden door. And that was a poem written by Emma Lazarus on the on the Statue of Liberty. So that was my introduction to the US. And it was amazing. It was completely amazing. At the dock, when I came from London to the United States, I was met by my only surviving relative, my Aunt Ida, who lived in Manhattan. And I joined her in her apartment and her husband. And amazingly enough, I went to Hunter College, which admitted me right away to study in college. And as long as I lived in New York, I was able to commute to Hunter College. And for 2 years, I had 2 years there. And in the meantime, I met my husband, who was 7, 8 years older than I, who came to visit me, who had his family got out to the US in 1939, before the war. And we got to meet and eventually fell in love. And we decided to marry in 1949. So in 1949, I was married to he was my third cousin. And we lived in various places and eventually moved to California. And we had 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, and then of course grandchildren that I still talk to, and my children. And that is really the story, which is quite even hard for me to believe now as I look back. When I came, so aside from going to college later on, I became a psychotherapist. I went to graduate school and became a psychotherapist, and have worked for many, many years as a psychotherapist, probably for some 25 years. So that is my story. And now, of course, I am 91 years old, and I live by myself. This is COVID time, so I don't have anyone with me. I never expected this kind of ending for my life, but it's a reality. And I'm again alone and managed by myself. So that's all I can say, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Lillian, for sharing your story with us. We appreciate it so much. And we do have some questions from members of our audience.
Great.
The first question is a really nice one. What is your favorite memory of being with your father as a child before the war?
My one of the wonderful memories, well, there are several. One is he used to take me to hunt for mushrooms and berries in the forest. And that was wonderful. He knew a lot about what was safe to pick and what was not safe. So my father and I shared that. We used to go into the forest and pick various berries. And this was a wonderful, wonderful memory. He also tried to teach me how to swim, but that was a fiasco because I apparently have a breathing problem that I didn't realize, and I never really learned how to swim. And he also taught me to play tennis. And I was an only child, and he was very much involved in my upbringing. So I still think of him. And in the book that I wrote a poem. I don't have the book right next to me, but you can find the poem I wrote in that book. Okay, anything else?
Thank you so much. And actually, while we're on that subject, what about a memory of your mother?
Uh, okay, the memory of my mother is very mixed because she was considered the second most beautiful woman in Lodz, where I was born, Lodz. Uh, and she was considered very, very beautiful. I was short and stayed short and skinny as a child, and she was about 5'6", which was tall in those days for a Jewish woman, very elegant and very beautiful. So she really wanted me to wear dresses. And I remember one incident. I was fishing, sitting uh, and fishing for tadpoles. And she came with a white dress with red roses that she wanted me to wear. And I tore the hair. There was a taffeta, beautiful dress, and I tore the dress out of her hand and threw it in the stream. So, yes, my relationship with my mother was really full of misunderstanding. She did not understand me, and I was mostly attached to my father, who understood me and spent time with me and came during summer holidays when he could get away from his work. And as I said, we used to gather mushrooms and berries in the summer. So yes, my attachment to my mother was much less, I must say.
Thank you very much. Um, was it common for Polish Jews to speak Polish instead of Yiddish at home?
Well, we lived completely in a Polish environment. We never, you see, you have to remember, we were not rich, but we were middle-class Jews. So we never lived in any, there was a Jewish ghetto, I guess, in those days, but we never lived. And in fact, I must say that I was warned by my mother, don't go near those Hasids because they have probably lice on them. So don't go near them. But we didn't really see too many of them because we lived in the Polish section of Łódź. So, and later in Warsaw too. So, you know, since we were relatively well off, we never lived in the Jewish ghetto.
Thank you very much. Do you remember anything in particular that you did to help stay calm during these scary situations that you were in?
Well, 1 year before the war, in 1939, actually less than a year, I had a nanny or an attendant who was Palestinian. She was Palestinian and she was a Zionist. And she imbued me with a sense of who I was, that being Jewish was actually quite wonderful. And there were Zionists, and we weren't just giving up. So I grew up with a notion that I had some amount of power and strength due to her. And that was really very important in my life. And I think that I was able to survive all the difficult times during the war because I was very sure of my Jewish identity. We were never, my family was not religious. I don't remember ever going to a synagogue or a temple or anything, but I got enough from that 1 year of that young woman who came and was my nanny, really, that I was Jewish and Israel was the place to go to. And it was very important for me to have my Jewish identity. And I will say that that is what sustained me during the war. It really did. It's a very important thing to have a Jewish identity.
Thank you. You mentioned meeting one of your cousins right after the war, who was with the officers who came from England. Did you ever meet him again?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I stayed in Germany, but it took me a long time to get a visa. I just want you to know that in 1944, 45, it took a long time to go to wait for a visa. It was very difficult to go to America. So I met my cousin when I was serving as a waitress in an American mess in Germany. It was very interesting. And my cousin notified my aunt in New York, and that is my only surviving relative. And that is how I got eventually to England. So that is the story. I
Thank,
had to wait.
thank you very much. Um, what was it like to learn English?
I can't even remember it. It sort of came gradually. I picked up here and there. And basically, I worked during the war, as I told you, in a German castle. And the Baron and the Baroness von Dietforth both spoke English at home. They were Germans, but they spoke English. They were an aristocracy. And so I picked up a little bit of English already then. And I didn't tell you, did I tell you how the castle was really my education, that wonderful 14th century castle in Germany, because it was full of artistic paintings and sculptures and porcelains and everything that of the goods of beautiful things that rich people used to look at and entertain with. So that is where I really got my first art education, was working in at Eagan, which means the eagle's castle, so to speak, in Germany.
Thank you very much. When you were in the forest for 3 days, how old were you at that time, and did you have food?
No, I didn't have food. I picked berries of some kind. I don't even remember exactly. I didn't have any food. And in 1945, I was born in November 1929, so I was 15, I guess. My math isn't too good, but I guess I was 15.
Thank you very much. Yes, that makes sense. Do you have any friends from Lodz or anywhere else in Poland who survived?
No, I actually didn't. Later on, I met some people who were survived. Actually, I met one young woman who was a survivor still early on, but we lost track of each other. And then, no, I didn't really. I belonged to survivor groups. You know, there were different people who survived in different ways, but nobody really quite the way I survived on the run, so to speak, and being very, very young and alone. So that was a little unusual because I was on my own really since 12 or 13, you see. And
Thank you. Did the conductor on the train already know about you, and is that why he told you to get off when where the
I
carriage
don't
was?
know how that happened, I must tell you. I really don't know how he told me to get off. They must have gotten a word from the castle where I stayed that they were looking for the laborer who was going to come. And I was identified as a laborer for the castle. So maybe that's how the conductor knew that. You see, I was also lucky that the other people on the train, I think I may have mentioned it already, were uh, 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 dark haired, much darker haired than I, and they were Armenians who were traveling, who were sent to Germany somewhere. I don't know where they were being sent, but they were not Poles. They were Armenians, so they weren't blonde and blue eyed, where I might have at the last minute gotten identified as a Jew, which I didn't. And so I was very lucky that they were Armenians rather than Poles. And just to follow up on that, and this is very much part of my talk when I talk to people, there are good people and bad people in every group. And I got a warning from the German workers when I worked in Germany that the Poles were talking about me as a Jew. And the reason they did that apparently was when I worked in the castle, I learned German very fast. And my first language was apparently German. When I was less than a year, I had a German nanny at 1 or 2 years, and I learned German very fast. So they had me pegged that I must be Jewish. But anyway, I had to run away at the end of the war, as I told you, because I was afraid. And I had a German supervisor come and tell me to run away because he heard that they were talking about the fact that I was Jewish and they were going to give me away at the very end of the war, which is really pretty appalling considering that I was only 14 years old. So there you go. As I said, one of the big lessons is that there are good people and bad people in every national group, and one should not generalize.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's an important lesson to learn.
Thank you. Do you know if the castle in Germany is still standing, and have you ever been back
I have
there?
tried to track it down. My husband and I went once back to, it was standing then. It was many, many years ago. And somebody lived in it, but not the original owners. And we couldn't get in. I couldn't go back in and take a look at it, but it was still there. And I imagine that it is still there today. It was called Eaganhausen, the house of the eagle. It was near Detmold in Germany. And it was as I said, I got my real art education in the castle because I had to clean and dust and do all of that. But they had wonderful art, wonderful carpets, wonderful paintings. So I learned a lot. And they had some German books that I started reading a little bit. I learned a little German and started reading. So actually, my time at the castle was a pretty good time. I did not have to work in the fields, which was good.
Thank you very much. What happened to Elizabeth?
Elizabeth died quite a few years ago already. She got cancer and she got quite ill, and she died 15 years ago, I believe. I'm not entirely sure.
Thank you. Have you been back to Poland after since the war ended?
My husband and I made a trip to Poland in, when did the wall come down? Do you remember? Was it 1948 or 9?
What was the question?
When did the wall come down?
Oh, oh, Berlin Wall, 1989.
In 89. That's when
Yes.
we went to Poland. In 1989, my husband and I went to Poland, and it was strange. I looked for my apartment, but it no longer existed as such. And we went up the kitchen entrance upstairs, and there was one woman and a child living in what used to be our kitchen. And she lived there with a child in just that one room. And I had some stockings and makeup and stuff, and I left it with her because I realized that she was very unable to get these things. She was a Polish woman, and she lived in what used to be our kitchen, just one room. And it was astounding. And she tried to get another place, but it was difficult to find places to live at that point. So she had to live there. Yes, I went back with my husband that time.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions about leaving your father and what anything else that you specifically remember about that. Do you remember what he said and how you felt and how you could see that
Well,
he was?
I remember one thing very distinctly. when Janina, who was my cousin's nurse, came to the ghetto the night before and talked to him, the next day he told me, just like that, I had to leave. But I had to memorize an address of a bank in New York to get in touch with my relatives in New York. And that is all I remember. That is really what I had to do. He told me to memorize, I believe it was Hanover Bank, and he told me to memorize where it was. And it was in New York. And I never saw them again. I left the next morning. Janina came and she begged Janina, the nurse of my cousin Elizabeth, who was only much younger, who was, I believe, 4 or 6 at the time, to take me as well, which was a big risk for her because being older, it was more difficult to hide us and to move around. And eventually she couldn't keep me any longer and I went on my own. And that is when I went to Germany. That is when I decided I lived in to go to Germany because I could not survive in Poland. I had dark hair and dark eyes, and everybody in Poland recognized me as being Jewish, whereas in Germany, nobody recognized me as being Jewish, except the Polish workers who recognized me, as I mentioned before, towards the end of the war and gave me away. But that was, that the Germans didn't know the difference because there were a lot of dark-eyed Germans. Unlike the Poles actually looked more Aryan with blue eyes and blonde hair than the Germans did. That's the irony of it. The Poles basically were very Aryan looking, and the Germans were often very dark haired and dark eyed. So in Germany, I could blend much better.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And did you ever get confirmation as to what happened to your family, or at least to most of them?
Well, yes, my aunt contacted I guess, I'm trying to think which organization, and they said that they were murdered in
Probably the Red Cross.
no, it wasn't the Red Cross. It was another organization. I'm blanking out right now, but they told her that they were all murdered. They told us that they were all murdered in
Right,
I believe in 1942.
um, thank you very much. We have quite a few more questions here. Do you have any insight into Mordechai Chaim Rumkovsky of the Lodz Ghetto
No,
and
I
that
never
part?
stayed in the Lodz Ghetto. I was only in the Warsaw Ghetto. We left Łódź right at the beginning of the war and moved to Warsaw. And we lived in the Warsaw Ghetto later on. And so I knew that Rumkowski was in charge of the Łódź Ghetto, but I didn't have any personal knowledge of him.
Thank you. You mentioned your book earlier that you had written. What is the name of the book?
No, it is a compilation. I'll give you, hold on just a minute.
Well, it looks like she's going to get the book, but I believe it is How We Survived, and Lillian is featured on page 413. Okay. She'll be right back momentarily, in fact.
The book is called How We Survived, and I'm sure you have it. And I'm trying to look at the poem that I wrote for my father, but I don't see.
I
It,
I have my copy right here.
you have
Your
your
story
copy
is
right
on
there?
page
Good.
413. And let's see if we have the poem. Oh, you know, I don't see the poem.
You don't see
Oh,
the
here it is. It's on page 413.
413? I
Yes.
see. Oh, yes, I see it right there. That's a picture of me when I was a little girl, right on that page. Uh, yeah, that is a poem I wrote because it was so important. Uh, you never asked me to tell your tale, but knew there wouldn't be time to tell yours. So you launched me as you would a ship, cheering on, while inwardly you howled with pain, handing me over to uncertain fate. Yet somehow certain that I would sail bravely into the rapids, just as we did so many times before when you blew your strong breath into the sails of my toy ships so they would reach the lake's farthest shore. You spoke quietly, urgency was outside the window over the cobblestones, with corpses piled on wooden carts rolled endlessly. Yeah, my dad was very, very instrumental in my survival. That is very important. I was very attached to my father because he was the one that did things with me. He taught me how to ski, how to ice skate, how to ski, how to play a little tennis, even. And we used to gather mushrooms and berries in the summer together. And so he was much more. My mother was very beautiful, as I mentioned, but her interests weren't physical interests. He was much more physically ready to do things with me. As I said, my mother was one of the two most beautiful women in our town, and she had other interests.
Thank you so much, Lillian, for
Yeah.
sharing that. And I actually am going to pull up this photo
Oh,
that
this photo, yes. Oh, you
this is
have
the
it.
photo. It's yes, this is from the book. I'm just pulling it up so that the audience can see it
Yes,
clearer. And
I have
Lillian, we
all here.
somebody would like to know how this photo survived. It says it's from Smarjev, Poland. I guess that's a town outside.
It's a village where we used to go every summer. I have my best memories from my summers in Smarzev. It was a village. It was a village where I was allowed to do anything I wanted to do, like go on the roof of a shed and jump down, which was dangerous, but there was nobody, to stop me. So I was riding horses bareback, and I love to ride horses because we had horses in the village. And so, yeah, every summer we went to Smarzev, which was the name of the village, and we spent the whole summer there. And my father used to come on the weekends. My father and mother used to come on the weekends. And I went with my nanny and stayed all summer in Smarzev in the village. And
Thank you. And how did that photograph survive?
I got that photograph from my aunt later on, my only surviving aunt in New York. She had some photographs, and that's what survived. Because obviously I couldn't carry anything during my various flights.
Of
And my
course.
aunt was actually, my aunt didn't have children. And for many years, she was working for the Jewish, oh God, I forget what it's called, um, uh, with all documents. She was a document keeper, Jewish.
Archivist, maybe.
Yeah, I'm trying to think exactly what it was called. It was one of the big organizations, Jewish organizations, because she had no children and she was very good at gathering information and so on.
Thank you very much. Somebody would like to know if, as far as you know, you are related to Lionel Trilling.
Well, we tried to trace it. We could never really trace any commonality. I know many times, but we couldn't. Although possibly way back when, because it
Right.
was an unusual name and it was never changed in Poland. Sometimes they spelled it with one L instead of two L's, but basically Trilling stayed, and they sometimes spelled it with a Y, a TRY instead of TRI, but basically the name stayed. And I later on, interestingly enough, my husband and I had letters from Germany from somebody named Trilling, and he told us that they knew that some of the Trillings went to the east, and we corresponded with them in Germany for a while. So we have some Germans who are called Trilling who are not Jewish necessarily. So it's kind of interesting. I
Thank,
think there was a Reverend Trilling, a Protestant Reverend Trilling.
thank
Yeah,
you so
the
much.
name was very easy to keep because it never betrayed any racial origin, any Jewish origin necessarily.
Right.
Although my
Thank
name during the war was Alicia Pashirkevich. I dare you to pronounce it.
Alicia Polchipkevich.
Pashirkevich.
Um, what is your advice to survive hard times? One of our audience members would like to know, given the difficulty of this last year, what advice would you give to people who are
Now you're talking
going?
about COVID and all of that.
Yeah, and just in general, anybody who's going through a hard time, what is your advice?
Well, my advice is taken from my own life. And I think it's important that you remember your identity, that you remember the good things about you. You remember why you were put on this earth to perhaps do some good and in limited ways, which is hard to do these days. But just staying alive is an important message because, like any war, people suicided during World War One and even during World War Two. But we have to keep our identity and we have to keep hope. And the hope is what sustains us. It's a hope of a better future. It will be a different future than perhaps we might have liked, but it will be a future in which people will go on, Jewish people and the world will go on, and we'll have to adjust to whatever circumstances require. And I think that's important. Being rigid is never very good.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
And you have to remember your identity. That is important.
Thank you so much. I'm sure that will really help guide people who are listening to this. I'm sure they will remember that. So
Yeah.
thank you. You mentioned that you were a therapist. Did you work with Holocaust survivors?
I worked with Holocaust survivors as well. I worked with all kinds of people throughout my career. And I loved being a therapist. I actually also enjoyed marital therapy very much. And the reason I did was that I'm sort of impatient. I don't know if you gathered that. And I didn't want to have clients saying to me, oh, he did this, or he did that, or she did this, or she did that when they were alone. So I preferred to work with couples when I could confront both of them. And because I'm impatient and I like to get things done rather than listen endlessly about each an individual complaining about their partner.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm sure you made a big difference in
Well,
people's
I have
lives.
wonderful letters. I have wonderful letters of, and actually, I help people even with their adult children, with their parents. And I have wonderful letters from people how it was helpful for them. And one time, a mother came back, came um, to uh, to New York from another city to just to see me, and it was wonderful.
Thank you so much. You mentioned at the beginning of your talk that you've been staying at home, obviously, this last year. Do you have family nearby or anyone who you've been close to in the last couple of years?
Well, my son lives down the street, but of course, due to the sickness and all of that, we haven't been able to see each other very often face to face. My other children and grandchildren live all over the place. They live back east, they live in the Midwest. So it's very hard. But yes, my son lives not too far from me.
Thank you very much. Um, we would like to conclude by asking you, why do you share your story? And I know that you, at the museum, you used to come in and speak to young groups of students, to
Mhm.
seventh and eighth graders, high school
Right.
students. What is your goal in sharing this story, and what would you like the audience today to take away from your story?
Okay, there are a couple of things. I think the most important thing is not to make judgments, not to make snap judgments about groups of people, not to realize that there are good people and bad people in every group. In my instance, I was rescued originally from the ghetto by a Polish nanny, the nanny actually of my cousin, not even my nanny, but the nanny of my cousin. And she was willing to risk and take me for a year. So this is good. There are some things that that people do that are bad, and that has to be recognized also. But everybody has to look for people who can do good, and all of us can do some good in our life. It's not always easy, it's not always simple, but on the whole, it's just as easy to be, no, I shouldn't say it's just as easy to be good as bad. Probably not. It's probably easier to be bad, though I don't know really. And to remember that you have to look at other people without prejudice And the biggest lesson that I would like to leave with my audience is there are good and bad people in every group, and we cannot generalize. We can't say, oh, this group is good and this group is bad. It's very, very important that the bad and the good can be in any group, and nobody should be designated just bad because they belong to a certain group.
Well, we thank you so much again for sharing with us and for everything that you have done for our museum over the last couple of years. And we're so happy that you are doing this Zoom talk now. This way you can reach people from all over who
Right.
are watching. And I wanted to just read a comment from you that one of our audience members said. She says, thank you so much for sharing your story. You're very brave and courageous, and you're an inspiration to all of us during this difficult time.
That's
So,
wonderful.
uh,
I'm so thrilled. I'm really thankful because it is really a story on how to live during difficult times, and we can all, and the important part is that you remember who you are, you don't deny who you are, and you don't, as I said, make uh, snap judgment about groups. This one is good or this one is bad. You don't. And that's important to know and remember.
well, we thank you so much, and thank you to our audience for asking so many great questions. Lillian, we're so grateful again to have you as a part of our community and to be sharing your story with us.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. I always dread it, but I always end up loving it.
Well, that's why we love having you do this. So thank you so much again. And to our audience, we're reminding you that our museum is currently closed for the time being, but we have regular programs online. Please follow our website. We have survivor speakers every Thursday at 11 o'clock. Next week, the talk will actually be on a Friday because we have another Thursday program. So please feel free to tune in. I know a lot of you watch on Facebook. Those who get our emails, you watch through Zoom. Stay tuned for all of our museum programs. Wishing everybody a happy, healthy, and safe weekend. And Lillian, you stay safe as well and have a good weekend.
And
We will be in touch, and be well.
thank
And
you. And
we hope to
thank you
see
for
you.
giving me the opportunity to do it. I always feel reluctant, but then once I start, I am okay and like to share.
Well, we're so happy that you do. So thank you so much.
Right.
And we hope to see you in person at some point
I hope
relatively soon.
sometime this year we might.
I hope so too. Thank
Yes.
you so much. Be well, Lily, and have a good day. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
everybody.
Bye bye.
Bye.